Gateacre, and it was just to show that this is really what we're talking about: listed buildings, or at least things that are designated as of national, cultural, or heritage importance. And Gail will talk much more about that in the presentation that's coming up. But just to say, as these pictures show, they are listed buildings cover a huge range of different things. I mean, obviously houses, the kind of the stately homes model, which is well known, but also memorials, fountains, street furniture. It's very broadly encompassing of all sort of man-made structures. So really, that's just to prove that we know what we're talking about, even though we're based in London or thereabouts. So Pierre, could you move on to the next slide, please? Just to run very quickly before we get into the main section of the presentations, and I've realised I've cracked on without actually introducing myself, so apologies. My name is Luke Wormold, and I'm the Senior Listing Policy Advisor with Historic England. I'll allow my colleagues to introduce themselves when they start. But the project stems from work that's been ongoing for several years now to look at the formally titled National Heritage List for England, more commonly called the List, capital T, capital L, which, as I've said, covers a broad range of assets. And this project will look particularly at built heritage, so listed buildings. And because we're talking about Gateacre, it's primarily urban listed buildings. Why we're doing that is because while the list itself in its various forms has been around for considerably more than 100 years, the sort of expectations of the list as a research resource, as a tool within the planning system, have all grown and expanded and become ever more ambitious. And we're looking now at work to make sure that the list as a resource can really meet those expectations, and that it can allow both those kind of more direct uses in terms of planning, but also for people who want to learn about their areas, about their heritage, about what's locally valuable and important to them, are able to do so using the list as a tool. So that's the sort of, we really want to ensure that the information we hold through the list can be seen as, robust and up to date, but that the doing of that is extremely resource intensive. It's a very formalized system. It's a statutory legal system. It has to follow due process. So we are investigating ways in which we can engage with others, communities, those with an interest, to help us with that important and big task. In return for that, or as a balance of that, we're hoping that this work will allow communities and individuals to better understand their heritage, better understand the systems that are in place to protect and promote it, but also to make sure that they feel able to do what they wish to do in terms of valuing and protecting heritage that matters to them. One of the things we've done in recent years as part of that work is to create what's called the Enriching the List program, also now called user-generated content, which allows for anyone really to contribute information that they wish to an entry on the list. There is still the formalized sort of legal part of the list entry that sort of can't change without formal process. But what you can then do is add photographs, any sort of research information that can be found about a site to that, and then that kind of adds on to the website for each entry. That's been a very popular resource, and I think I'm right in saying we're about 25% of all of the NHLE entries, of which there are 400,000 plus, have now been enriched, which is really welcome. And we're hoping, as one of the key elements of this project, working with you all, that we can make sure that the list for Gateacre is even better enriched than it is now. But from an entirely kind of historic England point of view, as I mentioned, the list is a very large and important resource, but it is huge, and some of it dates back decades and is not, as we would see it, matching what we want in terms of information or kind of current ways of displaying. So we're hoping that this pilot, and it's one of 3 pilot areas we're working on, will create for us a model we can reuse elsewhere, because what we need to know about a list in any given area is how accurate is it, how much other, the things on the list still as they were at the time of listing, can we add additional information that's important. So we're doing this very much as a test program, and that's why it's lovely to be working with you all on it. I should say, as something of a kind of disclaimer, that sadly, while we would love to be able to take all this good work and immediately make formal changes to the NHLE, if that's not possible just because of the resourcing elements I mentioned and the process that has to be undertaken. But we do want to be able to, as I say, enrich the list and test this model to see that it works. And if it does, we'll be looking to roll it out much more widely. So you're very much at the kind of cutting edge of what we're trying to achieve here. So that's really the two kind of key aims. We can discuss that more as we go along. Pierre, I think we've just then got the kind of format of the session slides. So just to reiterate for anyone who didn't catch, I'll hand over to Pierre in just 1 second to do a kind of quick overview of the National Heritage List and sort of what it is and what it comprises. We'll then have a sort of Q&A session and then a short break. And then Ken will pick up on 2 further elements, which is looking really at the kind of the formalities around what makes a building listable and how that process is undertaken. As I say, we're not actually going to be doing that as part of this project, but we want it to be something you're hopefully more aware of, or at least if you are already aware, that we can have a more of a detailed discussion about that. He'll then touch on obviously how, in terms of the how around site visits and the surveying work, and with a particular element on photography, but also on keeping safe, which is obviously a very, very important element of the whole thing. And then we'll have another section for questions at the end. Obviously, we have 2 hours, which we will happily use all of, or nearly all of, depending on how it goes. So hopefully that covers the main points from me. And I will, at that point, yes, hand over to Pierre, please. Thanks, Pierre.
Thanks, Luke. I'm Pierre. I am a listing officer at Historic England. And this first presentation will cover what national listing is in practical terms, going into the details of it, so that everyone here has sort of a concrete understanding of what we're dealing with, really. So you can find the definitions of the terms highlighted in orange in this presentation in the accompanying list condition and engagement glossary. And so statutory listing, or national listing, as we'll be referring to it in this presentation, is the term given to the process identifying buildings and sites of national importance and adding them to the National Heritage List for England, or NHLE, which is available to view over on the Historic England website. Listing allows us to highlight what's significant about a building or site and helps to make sure that any future changes do not result in the loss of its significance. Some of these buildings and sites, or designated heritage assets, as they're more formally known, will benefit from legal protection as the result of being included on the list, but all will be subject to national planning policy in the form of the current National Planning Policy Framework, recently updated in 2021. As a result, these designated heritage assets will be taken into consideration as part of the planning process, ensuring that their special archaeological, architectural, and historic interest is protected for this and future generations. So what's on the list for, what's on the NHLE? There are currently more than 400,000 entries on the NHLE, ranging from castles and cottages to buried Roman villas and shipwrecks. There are several different types of heritage assets listed on the National Heritage List for England, including listed buildings, scheduled monuments, protected wrecks, registered parks, gardens, designed landscapes, and registered battlefields. In addition to these assets, the list also records World Heritage Sites, certificates of immunity, and building preservation notices. The most common type of designation you'll find on the NHLE is listed buildings. There are about 380,000 listed building entries on the list. However, some entries include multiple buildings, for example, terraced housing. So the exact number is much higher. As the term implies, a listed building is a building that's been added to the list, and you'll find its details on the NHLE, accessed on the Historic England website. Listing identifies a building's special archaeological, architectural, and historic interest, and means that it's given legal protection under the Planning, Listed Building and Conservation Areas Act of 1990. Listed buildings in England are given special consideration in the English planning system and are also protected by national and local planning policy. Listing is a statutory function, meaning that the list is required by law or statute that if an asset meets the definition of a heritage asset and satisfies the principles of selection, it must be added to the national list. When buildings are added to the list, they're graded into one of 3 categories: grade 2, grade 2 star, and grade 1. So what is grading? Grade 2 listed buildings are the most common, with over 90% of all listed buildings at this grade. They're assets of special interest, warranting every effort to preserve them. Grade 2 star buildings are particularly important buildings of more than special interest. Currently, 5.8% of listed buildings are grade 2 star. And finally, grade 1 buildings are of exceptional interest. Currently, just 2.5% of listed buildings are grade 1. And grading only relates to certain entries on the national list. Scheduled monuments, registered battlefields, protected wrecks will not be graded, whereas listed buildings and registered parks and gardens will always be graded. What does it mean in national terms? In practical terms, sorry. As we mentioned earlier, listed buildings are protected by law, which means that there's extra control over the changes that can be made to the building's interior and exterior and its curtilage. Owners need to apply for listed building consent from their local planning authority for work that has the potential to impact the special architectural and historic interest of the building. However, listing doesn't mean that you can't do anything to a listed building. It simply provides a framework for managing and informing change so that the asset's special interest survives. For further information on listed building consent, please consult Historic England's webpage called Listed Building Consent, or contact your local planning authority. You can also consult Historic England Advice Note 16, titled Listing Building Consent. Whilst applications for listed building consent are determined locally, Historic England are consulted on applications which impact Grade 2 star and Grade 1 listed buildings, as well as the demolition of Grade 2 listed buildings. For how are buildings or structures listed? Let's look at the process of how some buildings become listed. In order to be included on the list, any potential building will need to be formally assessed. Anyone can nominate a building to be considered for listing. An application is submitted via the Historic England websites. Officers will then carry out an initial assessment. If it's of sufficient historic or architectural interest, it will progress to a full assessment, during which the Historic England will produce a list entry report, including a recommendation which is submitted to DCMS. It's the Secretary of State who makes the final decision as to whether the building or structure is added to the list. As part of this process, there will often be a consultation period to check the accuracy of the report before it's submitted to the Secretary of State. Buildings or sites which do not meet the threshold at initial application stage or after the full assessment may be eligible for inclusion on a local heritage list, if the area has one, and provided it meets the definition for heritage assets and local selection criteria. So next, let's look at scheduled monuments. There are nearly 20,000 scheduled monuments recorded on the National Heritage List for England. Scheduling is our oldest form of protection in the selection of nationally important archaeological sites. And when we talk about archaeological sites, we're referring to the evidence and remains of human activity over time. This can include things above ground, like castles or abbeys, and below ground, like Iron Age settlements or Roman villas. Scheduled monuments are protected by law under the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Areas Act 1979. Assets are assessed for scheduling using the relevant principles of selection published by the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, or DCMS. However, this is a discretionary function, meaning that whilst an asset might meet the principles of selection for scheduling, it may be that an alternative form of protection might be more appropriate for the long-term management or protection of that particular asset. In such cases, the asset is not scheduled on the National Heritage List for England, but will benefit from protection under national planning policy. Not all scheduled monuments are hundreds of years old. The scheduled remains of Cold War installations at Greenham Common, Upper Hayford, and Neath's Head were still in use in the 1990s. What does it mean in practical terms? Or what does scheduling mean in practical terms even? Scheduling monument consent is required for most works and activities that physically affect a scheduled monument. This process aims to manage and limit the level of disturbance to the monument without prior permission. Historic England administers the consent process and makes a recommendation to the Secretary of State for DCMS, who then makes the final decision on whether consent should be given. A scheduled monument is also protected against unlicensed metal detecting. A license is required to carry out geophysical surveys and use metal detectors over a scheduled monument. Historic England is also responsible for administering the application process and issuing the license. Let's look at the process of how monuments become scheduled. In order to be included on the National Heritage List for England, any potential site will need to be formally assessed to identify whether it should or should not be included on the list. Anyone can apply for the heritage asset to be scheduled. Firstly, an application is submitted via the Historic England website. Officers will then carry out an initial assessment. If it meets the definition of a heritage asset and appears to have sufficient archaeological and historic interest, it will progress to a full assessment, during which Historic England will produce a list entry report and provide a report with advice to the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport. As part of this process, there will be There will often be a consultation period to check the accuracy of the report before it's submitted to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State for DCMS makes the final decision as to whether the heritage asset is added to the NHLE, informed by the principles of selection for scheduled monuments. Heritage assets which do not meet the threshold at initial application stage or after the full assessment may be eligible for inclusion on a local heritage list. But remember that a site will only be scheduled if it is the most effective way of securing its future management. If a site does have national importance, but would be better managed under another protection system, it may not be scheduled. Let's look at protected wrecks. The Protection of Wrecks Act 1973 highlights the national importance of shipwrecks and secures their protection. The protection of wrecks is a discretionary function. To access protected wrecks, you will need a license from DCMS obtained through Historic England. Licenses are required for visiting protected wrecks and for any works that may disturb the wrecks or its contents. The application process is similar to that for listing, registration and scheduling. However, instead of the Secretary of State for the Department of Digital, Culture, Media and Sport making the decision, a decision is made by Parliament and protection is by statutory instrument. Remember, if it's not protected and added to the NHLE, it could potentially be added to a local heritage list if the area has one, and provided it meets the definition for a heritage asset and local selection criteria. Let's look at registration. There are currently nearly 1,700 parks and gardens on the NHLE and nearly 50 registered battlefields. Parks, gardens, and designed landscapes can be registered and included on the NHLE. They are protected by national planning and policy in the form of the National Planning Policy Framework. They can also be protected by local policies as part of the local development plan. Registration recognizes the significance of the site, such as wider planned landscapes, and ensures that their importance is given due consideration as part of the English planning system. Like scheduled monuments, the registration of parks and gardens is a discretionary function. The NHLE also includes registered battlefields. Registration of battlefields, registration of a battlefield provides protection through the English planning system, through national and local planning policy, and promotes a better understanding for their significance. Potential sites are assessed against the Historic England Selection Guide. Like parks and gardens, the registration of battlefields is a discretionary function. But what does it mean in practical terms? When a park or garden is registered, it's added to the National Heritage List for England. It is graded in the same way that listing buildings are, either grade 1, 2-star, or 2. But battlefields are not graded. Both registered parks and gardens and registered battlefields are a material consideration in planning terms. So the local planning authority must take the historic interest of the site into account when determining planning applications that might affect them. I've mentioned national planning policy several times in this talk. I'm referring to the National Planning Policy Framework document, which sets out different policies on how to approach development, including the historic environment. The current version was published in 2021 and is regularly updated. But Historic England managed the entire process for the registration of parks and gardens, as well as battlefields. Historic England will assess an application received for registration and will recommend whether or not the asset meets the criteria. If it does not, it may still be considered for local listing if the area has local heritage list, and provided it meets the definition for heritage assets and local selection criteria. As well as the above designations, you'll also find World Heritage Sites listed on the NHLE. These are defined as sites, places, monuments, or buildings of outstanding universal value to all humanity, today and in future generations. On the list of sites was developed after the World Heritage Convention, established in 1972 by UNESCO, or the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. World Heritage Sites include a wide variety of exceptional cultural and natural sites, such as landscapes, cities, monuments, technological sites, and modern buildings. There are currently 28 World Heritage Sites in the UK, including Canterbury Cathedral, Hadrian's Wall, Saltaire Village, Stonehenge, the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew, and the whole city of Bath. World Heritage Sites are recorded on the NHLE and are of international importance. They will usually include a number of heritage assets which meet the threshold for national protection, such as listed buildings and scheduled monuments. While they're not recorded on the NHLE, Historic England does not manage the application. Whilst they are recorded, on the NHLE, Historic England does not manage the application or assessment process. To find out more about the national listing and the NHLE, please visit the Historic England websites at www.historicengland.org.uk/listing. And at the end of this presentation, we will be sharing these slides at you, for you, all of the slides that you'll see, and the links on the slides should be working for you. And that is the end of the first presentation. Are there any questions? Or I'll stop sharing so we can all see each other. I think everyone's muted again. Okay.
Hi, Joyce. Yes, would you like to go ahead?
Hi. Earlier on in the presentation, I think you said that there were some 400,000 list entries, 25% of which had been enriched. Did I misunderstand that, or if I understood you correctly, how was that achieved?
Oh, right, yes. So enriching the list is something that anyone can do. So it's a way where there's a page on our website, which we'll share as well, part of this, where you can register. You have to register as a user, and then you can supply information that then is added to the list. But it's a different element from our formal updating of the list process, which is what Pierre was talking about there. But enriching the list is another opportunity for anyone who wishes to add photographs or information that's additional to what's already on the entry. And it basically means a quarter of the entries have had that done to them.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, it does, yes.
Thank you, good.
If I can just demonstrate with a shared screen, here's a list entry here for, that's Ely Cathedral actually. There's an overview. The official list entry comes there, and that's the legal text that forms the list entry in itself. And then this box here, this is the enrich the list section, and that is photographs that members of the public have submitted. You can see them all there. I'll talk a little bit more about it in my own presentation later.
Any thoughts or questions, or just sort of, well, I mean, did that feel like a sort of, I know it was quite a kind of high level summary, but was that how much of that was known, or was there anything that surprised you? Or
could I ask a question, please?
Go ahead, Phil. Yes, of course.
You briefly identified the aims of this project. What are your parameters going to be for measuring whether the pilot has been a success?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question, Phil. I mean, we were discussing this with Pam a few days ago in terms of how we will evaluate. I mean, we will obviously be seeking the feedback of all of you as volunteers as part of it, and we're very kind of open to that, because I think we need to know how effective this is as a process. It's something we haven't explored in this way before ourselves, so that'll definitely be an important element of how well it went. There will obviously be the success or otherwise measured on how much information we can gather as to the nature of the list in Gateacre, how much of the list entries are accurate, things like, are the locations correct, is the materials listed still the right way as they were at the time of listing. So there's a sort of practical element to that, but we're also, in terms of working with the Merseyside Civic Society and yourselves, wanting to learn lessons about more generally how effective this is as a way of operating. And if it is deemed to be good, I'm sure we will have lessons from it that we need to think about and possibly change the format. But we're hoping, as I said earlier, that this is something we can then roll out more widely. So the evaluation is around those elements of how much what we need came out of it, but also very much about how much of a useful experience it was for all of you.
That's good.
If any questions come up, if people think of questions later on, feel free to put them in the chat or bring them up at the end of the session as well.
Okay. Richard, did you have something?
Yeah, it's more practical. There's a Gateacre conservation area, but how far is the actual scope of our survey? How far are we geographically going?
Well, I think you've had the list of the index of all the streets. So there's, and the list that we sent through was showed you
beg your pardon,
the conservation area and then the places outside the conservation area, if you like. And I think there has been one additional entry that we've put in since the pack I sent you out, which is Acrefield Road. So
Okay.
I can't say exactly, but I mean it's listed buildings in the general vicinity, not restricted to the conservation area. I think that's fair to say.
Okay, I'll revisit that.
Well, we just have to sort of manage the process. You know, it's a question of trying to, you know, have a reasonable selection of places, but not obviously making it too onerous for the people that are taking part. And as I mentioned in my latest email to you yesterday, all of you, I'm in the process now of sort of matching the volunteers with the buildings, and you'll be getting that in the next week. You'll be getting, certainly by next Wednesday, you'll be getting the list with your allocation of buildings that you're going to do. And so we are suggesting that people work in pairs because it's well, it's much more fun, I think, and you can also learn from each other. Plus, there's a sort of safety side as well.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, adding to that, I think it's one of our interesting discussions around all this because we, you know, because this is a pilot and it's very new, we sort of wanted an area that would definitely be something that could be engaged with, but equally that wasn't necessarily, you know, that hadn't had lots of attention from Historic England, a recent resurvey or anything. So Gateacre, while there was some discussion about what was the best, it was definitely going to be, we think, a very useful area for this exercise. And as Pam says, very much about the most possible without being unreasonable in terms of the ask, not least in the timescale.
It is quite a sort of compact area, really, actually, but so which makes it a little bit easier, I think.
Yeah.
Joyce.
Yes, it's a question for you, Pam. Did I understand you to say just then that we already have something which delineates the area and lists all the properties? Only in the papers I picked up at the meeting, there isn't anything. And I don't know if there's something you've emailed and I've just assumed it was the same stuff and I've not looked at it properly.
Well, it has gone out to you by email, but I can resend that. I can resend it. Does anyone else feel they haven't received the list of?
In the pack that I picked up at the chapel, there was a map, a sort of vague, but there was, you know, I'd appreciate you sending.
There's an index. Did you not get these sheets?
No, I don't think I did either.
Yeah.
There's about a dozen attachments on an email.
There's quite a lot, yeah, and it goes through. That's it. That's it. Thank you very much, Margaret. That's it.
Thank you, Margaret. No, I haven't.
But I will send. I mean, to be honest, there's a lot of stuff in that email, and I don't blame you if you. And what we did is send you the whole list, and we've given you the brief descriptions of the streets and what the properties are. What I haven't yet given you is which ones we're asking you specifically to do, just to make clear. And I will do that within the next week. So don't worry too much about the whole list because that won't be your whole focus. But it has gone out. But as I say, I think there was one street missing from the index when I sent it out to you, which I will send round again. Is that okay? Yeah?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you, Pam.
Yeah. Any other questions at this stage? I was just saying, I don't think we'll find too many shipwrecks and battlefield sites in Gateacre. Who knows?
You know, if you do tell us because we'll need to report that out. I mean, it's just a sort of
except on a Saturday evening.
Yes, that's true. Outside the Brown Cow.
Sorry, battlefield site. Sorry.
The Black Bull, I mean.
I would think
Yes, outside remit. Sorry.
Yeah. Margaret, yeah.
You might be covering this in the second half, but I was just thinking of practical access to some places like Gateacre Grange, which is now gated because it's been divided into apartments. And it might not be easy to get in there to look at Gateacre Grange itself or the stable block associated with it.
I'll be covering that.
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
just because we have a little bit of extra time then, I mean, does, obviously based on Gail's really helpful kind of overview there, do you feel that you have a sense of what the different, a good sense now, a better sense, I suppose, of how the different regimes, I mean, they are all one big happy NHLE, but the different parts that kind of add up to make that whole list, and did that all make sense? Does there seem to be a logical, because there have been sort of discussions, but the last time this was looked at a very sort of legal point, was about bringing them all together into one big list, and some of that work's been done, but it remains in its, but did that all kind of ring true for you all, or was there any kind of confusion or questions coming out of that?
My surprise was to hear that the Secretary of State has the final word on things, so that makes me think that politics will no doubt enter the equation.
Well, yes, Margaret, that's a very fair point, and it is a political system. It's obviously it's a democratic system, and it's based on a law, a statute. So yes, it does have that. Obviously, we are very happy to be able to say that something along 99.9% of our recommendations are agreed. There tends to be one or two every few years, literally that kind of number where we don't agree, and even then, sometimes that can change over time. So a decision taken some years ago might be looked at again. I mean, we benefit hugely from a large number of very active stakeholder organisations who are very effective campaigners, and will, if they're not happy with the decision, they will put pressure on ourselves and politically as well. So I think it's a fair point, and but we certainly feel that having that democratic political decision making gives definite robustness to our recommendations. And it's an interesting point, and forgive me for slightly off piece here, but each UK home nation does it slightly differently. So in England, yes, the Secretary of State takes the decision. In Scotland, for example, it's done entirely by the organisation, our equivalent, our sister organisation, Historic Environment Scotland, who have had that function delegated to them. And there's swings and roundabouts. It can often, it might mean slightly less kind of interface with government departments, but equally then, as I say, it doesn't have that Secretary of State. And I know it's something that Secretary of States tend to find as one of the highlights of their job, if I can say that without being too biased. So no, it's definitely interesting. And of course, locally as well, the planning system is managed through the local government fund as well, so it does have that as well. But yes, it's certainly an interesting dynamic.
I think it's fair to say as well, isn't it, Luke, that places continue to be added to the list all the time. I mean, it's very active. I can think of several, in Liverpool in recent years that have been added. Well, quite a few. I haven't got the whole list.
Yeah.
But I think the most recent one was Bark Hill in the Iron Marsh site in Mossley Hill. That's now been added, I believe. Mm-hmm. Which again was a result of things that Civic Society, working with the Mossley Hill Residents Association, have lobbied for that and made the case, if you like. So that's a very recent one. And another project that we've been involved with is the Bucket Fountain in Piazza Fountain in Beetham Plaza. And that was added in fairly recent years as well. And that's just two that immediately spring to mind, but I'm sure there's a lot more.
There are. I mean, I haven't got the exact figures to hand, but we add, change good at about 300 to 400 entries a year, and that includes quite a number of additional added things. And obviously, what we consider to be, or what is considered to be, a special interest changes, not quite daily, but certainly with and things that used to be seen as of no interest whatsoever, up to and including St Pancras Station, which was slated for demolition. That kind of Victorian architecture was very unpopular at the time the list was new, and is now very much a focus of attention. And indeed, one of the reasons we're looking at this work is to make sure we can cover any significant gaps around that sort of age of buildings, and the things that are not necessarily what people would automatically assume to be listed buildings. So the fancy country houses and the castles, the great estates, that sort of thing. But we're looking much more broadly than that now, and it is a very dynamic archive. And sadly, that does mean things also come off, because ultimately some things either for because they ultimately fail as buildings or just are changed beyond recognition, will have to be reassessed. And this is obviously something we are very unhappy about having to do, but it's necessary, is that if the special interest is lost, then we will recommend its removal from the list. And that's a sort of sadder end of that, but it's definitely a dynamic resource.
Well, we're used to being struck off lists here.
We didn't want to be on it anyway. Can I ask, something just popped into my head, that might be a simple or a complicated answer. And if it's the latter, we'll move on. How does the list relate to the historic environment record that's maintained locally?
It's a very good question. I'm actually going to, just so you don't have to get more from me, but Ken, would you like to pick that one up?
Certainly, yeah. The historic environment record is, it's a record of absolutely everything of historic interest. Now, to be on a historic environment record, it doesn't have to actually have any significance. It is just a record of what's there. The one that I used to work for, we had a record of a myth on there because there was a myth that King John had lost his treasure in the Wash. I used to work in Norfolk. And so the King John's treasure was on the historic environment record, but it was just there as a record, as this exists as a myth. As you go through the historic environment, through the whole of the historic environment, you've got absolutely everything from myths right up to your World Heritage Sites, cathedrals, and everything else. The historic environment record has all of that on it for that defined area. The National Heritage List for England only has the material that has been assessed and found to meet the criteria for national importance within the boundaries of England, with a few minor exceptions, because there are a few sites which meet those criteria, but are not designated because of they're protected in other ways.
Sorry, who looks after the historic environment record?
That's the local planning authority usually.
Yeah. Okay.
There's every planning authority. National Planning Policy Framework says that every local planning authority should have access to a historic environment record.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's changed, but it used to be done by, it was a unit called Merseyside Archaeology Service, and it was, he's located in Sefton Council. Certainly the chap who used to do it, that may well have changed. I can easily find the answer to that, but it was done for the whole of Merseyside by one officer who happens to be located in Sefton Council, but it could have been any one of the 5 authorities.
Yeah, there are quite a few where there's an umbrella organisation. West Yorkshire, for example, the West Yorkshire Archaeology Service covers the whole of what used to be West Yorkshire, even though they are all a series of separate unitary authorities that are in theory not linked, but the historic environment record covers them all.
I'm not actually sure what the current situation is. I know it was, there's been a lot of controversy about it in recent years in Merseyside, about who's going to fund it, etc. But I don't actually know. It would be quite useful to find out. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, I should be able to find out via the Archaeology Society.
Unless John or anyone else knows about that. I don't know. No.
Because it was Ben Croxford, wasn't it, at Sefton?
I believe so. Yeah.
Anyway, I shall see if I can find out.
Yeah, it'd be interesting.
How, if it's being managed.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ben Croxford is given here. As I just one quick Googling later, and it does say Sefton. So
yeah.
Okay, right. I don't need to do it.
It's good.
But I think we would agree that the HER is a very important resource, but as Ken says, for sort of the everything element, but hopefully there's information that might be useful for this project in there as well.
And people can access that freely, can they?
Yes, as far as I know, the odd occasion I've asked for information, Ben has been very helpful.
I think when we come on to talk about the sort of next stage, obviously there's the survey work that we're going to be doing. There's also the enriching side of it, if you like. And we will be sort of suggesting people look at things like the HER and as well as obviously the ancestry stuff that we're doing to find out who were the occupants in, times past. And so that will form part of that sort of second stage, if you like, of getting that more enriched information. I think I know Glyn, who some of you met at the open day. He will be sort of helping us, giving us some pointers on where we can look to enrich the list. Yeah. Okay.
That's great. Was there any other thoughts, questions at this point? As Peter says, it's not a one, if anything does occur, we can cover it elsewhere or later on. It's not a problem. I hope otherwise that's been a helpful overview.
Just quite a lot of the Merseyside HER is available online. You don't actually have to contact them directly. You can look at their. I'll share a link to that. I'll share a link to that in my presentation anyway.
Lovely, thank you.
Thanks, Ken.
Of course, I mean, that really adds also to the point about, in recent years, the amount of information accessible, not just through contact but online, has just, exploded. So it's just, there's almost coming to the point of, it's not so much the difficulty of finding something, but finding the thing you need in the plethora of other things. So it's an interesting, different research technique. If it's more about, everything is available as opposed to trying to glean one or two things. Okay. Should we take a very quick, just 5 minutes then? Just quick break, and then we'll come back to
quick sandwich or whatever you're doing.
Yeah, anything you like, cup of tea. Yeah.
But feel free to come back with your cup of tea and your sandwich. Don't feel you've got to be on your best behaviour all the time. This is very informal.
Okay.
Okay, I'll leave the call open anyway, and then rather than get you all to come back on, we'll just leave it running. And
Thank you.
I'll stop the record. Oh no, maybe I won't stop the recording. I'll carry on just in case I lose it. But yes, great. Okay, see you later.
Yeah, see you in 5 minutes. Is that okay so far, Pam? Sorry, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, no, I think that's fine. There were some good questions, and they seem to be understanding it all, I think. And obviously, it's a canter through. I mean, I wouldn't. If someone did a test on it.
Oh, absolutely. No,
I wouldn't remember a huge amount of it, but I think it's good to give that overall context. Definitely, it's definitely worthwhile doing that. Yeah.
And yeah, absolutely. And we would. I mean, it is a large and complicated process, so we would. Do some research ourselves, but also to give the places to go on that. So yeah, I agree. Really good discussion. So, okay, great. I'll let you go as well.
Okay, yeah, I'll turn the video off for a minute.
Yeah.
Yeah. Want to have that
Oh, right. Yeah, that would be good.
Hopefully others will be with us soon. We can restart.
That was a very quick 5 minutes.
It was, yes.
Luke, where are you speaking from?
Currently,
What happened there? It's
Yes,
frozen.
Uh,
I don't know what you suggested, Sandra, but it's.
The reason I ask is I've just looked, I'm sat here waiting and looking out the window. I can see blue sky and sunshine, but of course it was lovely earlier on here. And here he is.
So what did you say? We asked you a question. We didn't hear your answer, Luke.
Which question? Sorry, I missed the question.
Sandra asked where you were speaking from.
Did I not answer that? I'm sorry, I'm in my office.
You froze.
Oh, I see. Oh, I'm sorry. The internet connection. Obviously, I am right in the centre of London, where even here you can't guarantee a decent internet connection. So no, I'm back in our London office today.
Oh, we've had some sunshine today here in Liverpool, you see. And
nice and bright here.
Some blue sky out the window.
Well, it's interesting. I'm now seeing rather looming grey clouds blocking out the sun, because you've probably seen as I've been talking, I'm having to narrow my eyes because the sun keeps coming out. But also, yes, it's a bit changeable, but it's not bad. It's not bad at all.
Yes, I'm glad you're having some sunshine down there as well.
I hope it returns up there as well. It was very nice this morning because obviously we haven't been into the offices over since really November, and actually when I left my house this morning it was just beginning to get light. So it felt like we'd missed that really dark bit, which was no bad thing.
Are people generally coming back into the offices now, would you say?
Just beginning to, I mean, we had obviously before the plan B of late last year, we've been moving into a trial period for our hybrid arrangements, which is happening in all of our both London and our regional offices, and that basically involves kind of being in the office 2-3 days a week and then working at home the other days, and that's just sort of, again, a trial to see how that's all working in terms of, and it seems to be working so well so far, and I think people appreciate the variety, as it were.
Absolutely, yeah.
But it's nice, I have to say, despite commuting, it's nice to be back and see people.
I think that's just over the quarter of the organisation work from home anyway.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I think we got most people.
Okay.
I mean, some people are muted, some aren't, but no, I think I'll just mute the people who are not going to be speaking then now, if that's all right.
Yeah, thanks, Pam. Ken, over to you.
Righto, I'll just see if I can work this screen sharing and work my pronunciation as well. That would be good. I'm Ken Hamilton. I'm a national listing advisor at Historic England, so I do designation on a day-to-day basis, really. And I'm going to give a quick run through how to decide whether to apply for national listing. I mean, I know it's outside the scope of the project, but I just think it would be useful to run through the listing process, how the list works in practical terms. It's quite a good introduction to the NHLE online as well, because the first thing, obviously, that you'd want to do is check. Hang on, let's see if that will change the slide. Yes, it has. Yeah, the first thing to do, obviously, is to check whether something's already on the list by checking the NHLE, the National Heritage List for England. And you can search by site name or place or postcode, although obviously the more specific that you get, the better. For example, if you search for High Street, you get 46,857 hits, which isn't particularly useful. If you know the postcode, that will bring up a map. And if you're unsure of the exact name, map search probably more useful anyway. The other thing to just bear in mind is that if you're looking for all the listings in a given area, you need to use the map search and not the postcode, and not the text search, because the map will show you all the listings. If you search on one individual listing, it will only give you the map for that list entry on its own. Hopefully that makes sense. So as I showed you earlier, the list entry, the results include the list entry and additional comments and photographs submitted through enriching the list. So once we've checked that it's not listable, then we need to check if it can be listed. There are a few things that can't. Portable objects can't be listed, and there are non-designed landscapes. So an archaeological landscape in itself can't be listed, or the individual elements of it can. And I should just point out that for the purposes of this, I refer to everything as listing, whether it's scheduling, protection, recs, registering battlefields or parks and gardens. Just it makes it easier for me to say. It needs to have a degree of historic significance, and that's something that sets it apart from the majority of places in the country. And the government have some formal definitions of this, which they publish in the Principles of Selection for Listed Buildings. And as Pierre said, these presentations will come out to you with the links in them, and the Scheduled Monuments policy statement, which is there. And what they tie the principles of what of significance down a lot more tightly. In terms of buildings, that would be architectural interest and historic interest. In terms of scheduled monuments, that's archaeological interest, historic interest, and its archaeological potential, or how likely it is to provide evidence of past activity. And we receive a large number of requests every month. Luke said there's about 300 to 400 cases get added, or assets get added to the list every year. We look in detail at a couple of thousand every year, and we receive far more requests than that. So we need to prioritize our resources. And so we look at that. We look at everything that comes through against these three criteria here. Is it under serious threat of demolition or major alteration? Is it within the remit of one of our strategic listing priorities? They're all on our website. They tend to be things like, is it in a high heritage action zone, and so on? Or does it have very strong potential for inclusion on the NHLE? So in order to answer the questions of significance in a little bit more detail, we need to understand the asset and do a bit of research on it. And that means that if we do get to writing an application, then the application can be more focused and create a more convincing case to get it to the assessment stage. There's some help for this on some types of heritage asset on the Historic England website in the form of the Introduction to Heritage Assets. Now, these are not comprehensive. They cover what they cover, and they're not updated either. So they cover a point in time. The selection guides, which details what we're actually looking at. The principles of selection from DCMS say that if a building is older than 1700 and largely intact, it should be added to the list. If it dates between 1700 and 1850, it probably would do. And newer than 1850, you need to have more reasons to add it to the list, and so on. The selection guides narrow those down and add some more detail to those, and sort of flesh that out a bit and take it away from just a reliance on dates. And then for more information, you can look at our historic environment records. We talked about those earlier. The site where I found the Merseyside HER details is the Heritage Gateway, and that's a really good place to start. It's got links to every historic environment record in the country, and those that have an online database, you can generally access it through the Heritage Gateway. As I say, this presentation will be sent out to you. Don't forget your local archive centre. They are fabulous. National Archives, if that's relevant. Historic maps are always a good place to look as well, and newspapers and journals. And I've put a link to the British Newspaper Archive there, because that's something I personally use a lot in my own work. So once we've been through the principles of selection, the selection guides, we're happy that it meets the criteria. We've been now in a position to think about applying, and we do this through the Historic England website. And before starting, it's worth having a look at the application checklist, which is there, but which will run you through the form. Now, it's just worth saying at the moment we are currently revising the form, so I'm not going to go through it. But yeah, the application checklist does help. And the same forms used for listing, scheduling, amending a list entry, protecting a rec, parks and gardens, certificates of immunity. And you can see the sort of thing that we're looking for there: identification, location, the extent of it, the threat, the reasons for photographs, and so on. So the application process, As I say, you'll need to provide a range of information, a location being the most obvious, because the law can't protect something that doesn't have a location. I said that you can list it on an HER. You can't put a site without a location on the NHLE. And we need to define those extents by drawing a box around them, which could be straightforward with a rectangular building or a little bit more complex. This is the duck decoy in the Norfolk Broads, and it's got a circular drain around it. So I started mapping that, and you can see that it takes a bit of time. But it just gives you the idea. You don't have to be exact because case officer will need to check it anyway, but being as accurate as possible helps. If possible, we need to look at the owner's details. It's not always possible, but it's very hard to assess an asset without the owner's details, as Historic England need to access the asset to assess it fairly. We have a few tricks up our sleeve regarding finding owner's details, but they're not foolproof, and sometimes there's no substitute for local knowledge. Details of any current planning applications are required if the asset's under any sort of threat, and the details of that threat help us to prioritize the case, and urgent cases can be progressed very rapidly if necessary. And details of planning applications are obviously available on your local planning authority website. And we need to supply a reasonable set of photographs of an application so that we can make an initial assessment rapidly and accurately. Not everything's visible on Google Earth or Google Street View, and Historic England can't visit every application prior to assessing it. I mean, I've worked on cases from West Cornwall through to Kent and up to Cumbria, both on and offshore. And if I had to visit those, every single one before assessing it and then while assessing it, I do nothing but travel. But legal requirements of photography need to be adhered to, and we'll talk about those in a minute. I need to say why I think it should be listed and present our supporting evidence as well, so that Historic England can make a rapid and informed decision about whether to take it forward for assessment. Basically, the more information you can put up front, the better. So what happens after that? Once the application's been sent into Historic England, it's checked to see if it's valid, to see if it meets the very basic criteria, and it undergoes a rapid initial assessment. This is the point where we as Historic England check if it merits a full assessment, and if not, a full rapid report is written and sent off to DCMS with a recommendation to reject it. Again, DCMS make the decision, as Pierre mentioned earlier. If it does go forward for full assessment, the owner is notified. We organise a site visit. Case officer writes a draft list entry with a short history of the asset, any key individuals involved, and a description. The description's not prescriptive, it only sets out what's significant. And in normal circumstances, the draft list entry is sent out to the owner, the applicant, the planning authority, and so on for comment on its factual content. Case officer then writes a final report, amending the list entry if necessary, and that's sent on to DCMS. And again, as pointed out earlier, the decisions made by the Secretary of the State, except for registered parks and gardens and battlefields. Once a decision's made, the owner is notified and the NHLE is updated. Now, it's a very rapid run through of the process, and I do appreciate that I rattled through it, but it's more to get you seeing what's involved in putting something on the NHLE, and to get you thinking about why things are on the NHLE. I'm going to spend the rest of my talk talking about site visits and photography. So there's a few points worth going over, both from a legal and a technical point of view. I'm not going to talk about apertures. I'm not going to talk about shutter speeds, lenses, f-stops, anything like that. So that's well beyond the scope of this project and beyond my own level of skill, frankly. It doesn't matter if you have a box brownie, a smartphone, a top-end SLR. Principles I'm going to talk about should all hold. Most important principle in any photographic exercise is to stay safe. And I'll go over this again, and I'm sorry if it's sort of teaching you things you already know, but we can't emphasize that you need to be safe often enough. It's so easy to get fixated on what's on the viewfinder or screen as you hold it up there and you move about, and all you're looking at is the screen. You miss what's going on around you. You can accidentally step off the curb and into live traffic. Even without live traffic, a significant stepping off of curbs accidentally is a significant cause of compression fractures in the spine. So we don't want any of that. So watch where you're going when you're stepping backwards, and watch where you're going when you're stepping forwards as well, because a lot of street furniture is placed at a really awkward and uncomfortable height if you bump into it. So you need to look where you're going. As a general rule, don't move while you're looking in the camera. Move, then look in the camera, move, then look in the camera. Be aware of the social situation around you while you're photographing buildings. And in particular, try to be aware of people and what people are doing. Concentrating on electronics in the street makes you a target for theft. Public photography can make people become aggressive. These circumstances are rare, but they're worth being aware of. And if you're in any doubt at all, just move on and return when the area is less crowded. In a similar vein, keep an eye out for dogs and be prepared to move on if necessary. Never take a chance with a dog. I don't take a chance with people either. Most of these are only risks as you're concentrating on something else whilst in the public domain. Now, I noticed that Pam said that it would be good for you to go out in pairs. I would definitely recommend that. If you must go out on your own, tell someone where you're going, tell someone how long you'll be, and what time you'll contact them when you're finished, and contact them when you're finished so they know you're safe. So there's always a record of where you are and what you're doing if you're concentrating on something else. So there are a number of photography websites that will detail the legal rights of photographers in varying levels of detail, but the general summary is UK laws are quite relaxed. Individual photographers can photograph buildings without needing permission, provided you're in a public space. The rules are not so clear-cut for professional photographers, but as we're not talking about commercial photography, I'm not going to go into that. Similarly, the law doesn't prevent you from photographing people so long as they're in a public space, but doesn't necessarily make it a good idea. So I think we just break down the legal aspect and look at the reality of it. The first is photographing individuals can constitute harassment. Harassment's a crime. Photographing isn't a crime. Harassment is a crime. Don't do it. Don't photograph people. Photographing children, whether legal or not, is not one out of shot and come back another time. It's just too easily misunderstood, and best just to avoid photographing people at all. Entering private property without permission, that's trespass. Keep your photography in the public realm and the law is on your side. So just keep it, stay on public land. If someone objects to you taking photographs of their building or of a person or whatever, just delete the photograph and move on. You may legally be in the right, but it's not worth a confrontation. Nothing in this project is worth not worth a confrontation. So the project can't, and also the project can't use any photograph taken in contentious circumstances. As the photographs get uploaded to enrich the list, there are requirements on the enrich the list website, but if the people regularly contact the enrich the list, I can't say this. Excuse me while I have I'll try wet and whistle. Yeah, people regularly contact the enrich the list team and say, I don't like the fact that my building's on your website. We've perfectly got a right to put that building on our website, but we take the photograph off anyway because we want to keep people on side. But there's the permission summary. It's on our website. I mean, to upload a photograph, you need to register, log in, and go to the list entry and upload the photograph as it says. It's very easy to use, but bear in mind the team will reject photographs where the legality of the photograph's called into question. They won't upload any where the copyright's not clear. They won't upload any with faces on them, car number plates, or blatant advertising. I mean, it's common sense stuff, really, but it has to be said, I'm afraid. So the legal side, so much for that. I'll go through a few basic principles of taking illustrative photographs of buildings, because it's not necessarily the same as taking a good photograph of a person or a good holiday snap or whatever. But the secret to good photography of any kind is planning. And since photography revolves around light, that's what you have to take most account of after your own safety and the legal niceties that I've just discussed. It's very difficult to take a good photograph in bad light. Rain will confuse camera sensors. That's assuming your camera is waterproof in the first place. Thick cloud can confuse light sensors inside cameras, leading to them being underexposed. Very bright conditions have the opposite effect. Bright sunlight can wash out details. So check the weather forecast before you go and be prepared to be flexible. Oh, and charge your camera as well. Photographs taken, oh, hang on, excuse me. Right. Once you're out on site, don't be in a hurry to start taking photographs. Walk around the building, staying on public land, obviously, looking for the key views and the important details. Think about what's significant about the building and how to show those details most effectively. Really have a look at the building and plan your photographs before you take them. So you should just be thinking each individual one, will that say what I'm trying to say with this photograph? Look at where the light's coming and how it falls across the building. If there are strong contrasts, it'll be difficult to capture detail without either washing out the light areas, like this bit up here, or making shaded areas too dark. And that applies no matter what camera you use. If it's a really bright sunny day, you might not be able to capture a decent shot of some buildings, or you might have to come back at a different day or a different time of day, and try to avoid shooting into the sun, because that will again confuse your camera sensors and put sparkles all over the photograph. Try to keep your composition simple, because the subject can really get lost in a busy photograph. This example contains 3 vessels on the National Register of Historic Vessels, and at least 3 different listed buildings, possibly 4, depending on how you count them. So it's hard to determine what the subject of the photograph is. So as an enriching the list photograph, it's not that great. In addition to the lack of clarity, there's a lot of detail in a cluttered photograph, as the eye cannot take everything in, and there's a limited number of pixels in a camera sensor. It's also worth keeping an eye on your photographs every time you take one. Just have a quick look in the viewfinder in the back of your camera, particularly where it's hard to get a clean shot. Always look at the shot you've just taken and make sure that the area you want to illustrate is in focus, and you don't have a really detailed photograph of an overhanging branch and the building behind is just blurred. I have no end of photographs like that. So wherever possible, try to capture an entire elevation, preferably of each accessible side of the building, but keep to public land. If you can't access another side of the building from public land, you can't, just don't take the photo. Where you can, give the building some room, so it's got a bit of frame, some room to breathe, as it's called. Although obviously not so much that the building's lost in its context and you can't really see what the building is. Camera lenses, and particularly wide angle lenses like those on phones and more budget models of camera, tend to distort any subject that's relatively close in. It's particularly an issue with buildings where one's shooting upwards at ground level to an elevation. There is a specialist lens that can cope with that for SLRs, but they're really expensive. So a cheaper option is just to look for a way of taking a photograph from a slightly higher point, or slightly higher elevation. Unusual angles might also be a better way of illustrating a building's form. So just keep an open mind, look for high ground to take photographs on, and don't get set in thinking I must take this from ground level in a set way. Garden features are particularly difficult to photograph from ground level, but some of them have raised areas designed to allow people to better appreciate the garden. So use them, that's what they're there for. And in fact, this is a photograph of a raised mound built to allow the garden to be appreciated from an elevated viewpoint. I was lucky to find a higher viewpoint to photograph the mound from, because taken from ground level, you couldn't see what this was in its context. So always keep an open mind, look at where you can take shots from, but again, stay on public land. So having presented the ideals that you're going to be photographing in an urban area, and a lot of these principles are far easier said than done. In most instances, your compositions will be determined by the space available, but there's a few tricks worth bearing in mind. Given the constraints of space and equipment, some distortion is inevitable. So pick a vertical line in a building and keep that line vertical. In fact, try to keep as many verticals as close to vertical as you can. And you can use that principle to capture entire elevations at an angle, taken at an angle. And it comes back to planning your shots. What's important? How do you illustrate that? In this shot, the narrow street actually helps to illustrate the key features of this building, which these two jettied structures here, which show it to be a Wealden house. It's not a particularly great photograph for illustrating the frame, but I covered that with additional photographs. In this, I wanted to show that it's a Wealden house. So additional photographs brings me on to detail. Some architectural detail will be lost in a full elevation. So please feel free to take additional shots of key features as required, such as date stones, insurance plaques, intricate moldings, anything like that. You can also include things that reflect the building's history, such as blocked openings, historic graffiti, or relic signs. And these are 16th, 17th century hands carved in a cathedral cloister, carved by iconoclasts who were destroying religious imagery at the time. Where the detail is small, it's good to include some sort of scale. I've used a scale card there, but you could also use a ruler, a coin, your hand, anything that just gives you an idea of size. Now, we mentioned interiors briefly earlier on, and I haven't mentioned them in my talk yet. That's because interiors are out of scope of this project. The vast majority of listed buildings are private homes, and people have a right to privacy. Inside homes, it's harder to avoid photographing personal information. Homeowners have concerns about their personal safety, and some don't like interior shots of their house being put online because it can be seen as an invite to thieves. More practically, gaining access to buildings is really difficult. And if you're doing more than one building in a day, just as an administrative exercise, trying to get access is very hard. What's most important, though, on this is that these are private spaces, and that you're going into this private space. Excuse me while I get rid of that. Occupants could have COVID. You know, that's just as an example. They could have a dog, and the dog might not like you. You're putting yourself in a situation where your personal safety is guaranteed, and you don't necessarily have a clear escape route, should it be required. There could be any number of situations that can make you uncomfortable or put you at risk. So from the point of view of this project, interiors are out of scope, so just stick to public land. So up to now, I've been talking about photographing buildings, but there are other heritage assets on the list. The scope of scheduled monuments varies widely, so it's difficult to give any kind of meaningful guidelines specific to scheduled monuments that aren't already covered by those covering buildings. And the same can be said about parks and gardens, really. Archaeological sites and parks, gardens are very difficult to photograph from ground level. So if you can get some height, get some height. Otherwise, do what you can. Most shipwrecks are underwater or intertidal, and they're out of scope of this project because photographing them is a specialist job and extraordinarily risky. Wrecks above the high water mark can be confusing and frequently don't look like ships or shipwrecks at all. This particular one, which is the Vicuna on the North Norfolk coast, I spoke to a load of dog owners who'd walked past it for 25 years and didn't realize it was a shipwreck. However, once you've identified them, the same rules apply. Plan your visit, take your time, plan your photographs, stay safe. And that's about all we can say about them. So if you want to find out more, again, you will be provided with these links. You can have a look at the NHLE. Oh, hang on, the Enriching the List guidelines. And there's more detailed guidance from our photographic team on the Historic England website, and there's the link there, which brings me on to my any questions slide. So I'll stop sharing my screen if I can find out how. There we go.
Let me just unmute people. I'll ask to unmute. I can do this the better way.
Great, thanks, Ken. Richard, first question.
Hi. A lot of listings refer to very detailed parts of a building's form, elevation, and so on. In Nicholas Pesner was a great man at doing that. How much of that do you need recording in words, or will the photographs be sufficient?
I would say do it with photographs. It's so much easier, given that I do both.
Right.
What I always find we can't put photographs on our list entries that we submit to the Secretary of State, and I always find that incredibly frustrating, because it would be so much easier to just sort of say this bit instead of having to describe whatever. You can get very wordy very quickly. I'd concentrate on imagery where you can.
Great. I quite agree.
It's an interesting point, though, because the nature, as sort of hinted at earlier, when listing first began, the first list entries were literally a description so that you could tell it was the building you meant. So
yes,
it was sort of, our forebears have put it like that, with a pad and a pencil going around. And then it sort of grew and grew and grew until you did get to this point where I think we went too far the other way, and every window with every glazing bar was described in detail, which made the whole thing vastly long and incredibly hard to, if you didn't have a very good grasp of all of that architectural language. So definitely now into the middle zone, and as Ken says, the kind of, when we can use images, we really like to, because images speak many words, as well known.
Thank you.
That's a good point what you said there, Luke, actually, because the list entries were originally designed, and to a certain degree they still are designed to be legal documents that are used for planning purposes, rather than necessarily, they're not a historic record of the building. They are a legal document to allow planning decisions to be made in an informed way. So they concentrate on that, and they're worded in that particular way. And that's why the Enriching the List project exists, basically, is because that's not a suitable way to get people to engage with the list in a more active way and find out about the local heritage that way.
Can I just ask a question? Are you looking for the volunteers to directly enrich the list that's there at the moment, or do you want us to collect the information separately first and check it? And
well, I mean, I think probably just because of the nature of what we're doing, probably a bit of the kind of let's gather it together as a team, and then we can do a kind of en masse enriching.
That's what I envisaged, actually, rather than people going directly into the the enriched record, if you like, and altering it. I think we should have a sort of a
and I think just
stage where we look at it all and check it and things like that.
Exactly, and just also because I think for us as well, a bit more of a kind of understanding how much happened because of this. That's not to say, though, that if you then want to become an enthusiastic enricher of the list and carry on doing so, and those teams would be more than welcome. The other thing just to say, and Ken did make the point, is that sadly, and the word resource keeps appearing, but we have a small team here that do the moderating, so we don't really want to kind of bombard them with huge amounts of stuff all coming through over a period of time. So how we can manage that flow, which we will take on ourselves once we've got the package of information, just to make sure we can get all of it on as quickly as possible.
Okay.
Dave.
It just struck me, actually, by collecting the information together, part of the learning from the project then is looking at that information, looking what people have picked up on, and the learning for both sides, for the volunteers involved and for Historic England. I think considering collectively what people have come up with is actually one, quite an important outcome.
Yeah.
Completely agree.
Yeah, I agree.
And in fact, on that, Pam, just let's think about how we can have thinking probably towards the end of March, just as the project's wrapping up, that stage of it, we probably should have a session, if we can, to just kind of get together, even just for an hour or so, just to talk through that.
Definitely,
diaries and arrangements, but and absolutely your point, Dave, we are learning too. I think that's a really important aspect of all of this. We're testing new ideas.
Yeah.
Were there any other questions about sort of the practicalities? I mean, going back to the question about accessing gated communities, I think we would have to urge on the side of caution there. I mean, the key point is do not go off what is public land. So if it involves going through a gate, walking onto a driveway, don't do it. And if you can't get a decent image because of that, then we'll manage that somehow. But we really absolutely emphasise it's not for. We don't want to either put you in any form of risk for this. So the safety element is absolutely paramount. But also, don't do anything that would put could be construed as trespassing or anything. It's just that's not the purpose of the project. I mean, if, for example, and we've been talking to Pam about how we will alert people to the fact that there will be this going on, and that if people see people taking photographs in the street, they may be interested. It may be that as a back of that, somebody who does say, oh, come in and sort of hear about my house, and that would be lovely, and please do listen to that. But I would probably urge against any sort of internal photographs, even in that instance, just because we can think about what we do with that later on. But in this instance, I think just to keep things as straightforward as possible, let's avoid that. And if there are any specific questions, then hopefully Pam, myself, the team can help with those. But generally speaking, I think that's the sensible rule of thumb for all of this.
Yeah, I have mentioned to the volunteers that we have I've drafted a letter for them to sort of drop off in the mailbox of the properties they'll be surveying. You can do it just as you go around. You don't necessarily need to do it in advance or anything like that. But it'd just be a letter which just explains, in brief what we're doing, and saying that people won't go into their private space. And I've put something like, unless you invite them or something like that. But then that would be down to you as volunteers to say to whether you wanted to do that anyway. And I've put me as a contact person if they want to know anything more. And we also done you a letter of authorization, which will just be one copy that you'll get, where if anyone says what are you doing here, this sort of thing, then you can show them what it is as well. So people that are not necessarily residents but just interested passers-by. I mean, when we were talking the other day, that you did mention about notifying the local police. I mean, what is your local police station in Gateacre? Anyone?
I think it's the one in Belvale, actually. I think the nearest, in Belvale.
Is it Belvale? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
I can't see them being terribly interested. No. Has anyone?
Bigger fish to.
Yeah, I think keeping the good citizens of Belvale.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So I wasn't planning to do that unless anyone feels very strongly that we should. But obviously, do feedback to me if you have any issues at all. I'm not envisaging you will at all, but just do feedback to me, anything that comes from that.
Would be the view on using drones.
Oh wow!
For inaccessible buildings.
Excellent cutting edge technology reference there, John.
Drones. Legally, so long as you take them, as long as they take off and land from public land, then they're in the same situation as ordinary photographs. However, I would suggest strongly, if you were going to do that, to keep them flying above public land. Even though the airspace above a property does not belong to the property, I would keep them in airspace above public land, just for the point of view of making it unequivocal that what you're doing is completely harmless, and don't put them near a window.
Have one, by the way, but
I don't think we're planning to do drones. But it's an interesting concept though, and it has got lots of potential, presumably, for more inaccessible buildings.
It is a technology that we use in the historic environment in general, to take in-depth surveys on various hard to access places. But the legal aspects of it you've got to take are the same as taking photographs on land, basically.
We did have a question earlier on. Sorry, Joyce.
it sounds as if it's something that's best done by professionals. Obviously, the people at Historic English Heritage know all the legalities, and it's probably best left to you.
Can I just go back to the question that was raised earlier about what do you do if there's a large listed building that's now been converted into flats and is behind sort of it's like a gated community. So I don't know which building that is. Is it?
Gateacre.
Sorry.
Gateacre Grange.
Okay, Gateacre Grange is the example. What have you any suggestions on that, or do we just forget about it? Or
photograph what's accessible from the pub in the public realm.
Yeah.
It has, if it has a public frontage, you can photograph that. The bits that aren't accessible from public land, you can't photograph.
Is it behind a wall? So I don't know the building. Yeah, it's behind a
heavily landscaped on the boundary by trees, etc.
Yeah, so that might be tricky.
If you can't access it, you can't access it.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
What if one of the residents says, would you like to come in to photograph the outside? So you're not going within the purview of their property, you're going within the estate with permission.
That's a tricky one.
Take the owner's permission rather than the tenant's.
Well, let's assume they own their property.
But it's only one apartment of many. I mean, I think, there's probably an ambiguity there that we probably don't want to investigate too much at this point. I mean, because, one person invites you in, but then somebody else is very annoyed at that. I don't know. It's a complicated one, but I think, to try and make a positive of that, these are sorts of situations we're going to hit if we do these things elsewhere. What about the case? So actually, rather than, I think it'd be helpful for whatever happens to be reported back in terms of we couldn't access this site because then we need to think about what that might mean for other areas. I just would want to verge on, both with this and the caution being the primary principle here. So even if you're invited, I just think that might still not be quite the level of comfort we would need, especially if there's a freehold tenancy issue as well. So.
And that particular property, I think all of the residents are tenants. They don't own the apartments.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, in normal circumstances, and we do hit across this sort of multiple ownerships, multiple, or a freehold with multiple tenancies, we do what we always make, what we call reasonable efforts. We must make reasonable efforts to contact owners and residents. In this case, just because of the nature of the project, well, I think probably not, because what we would do probably there is seek to find whoever is the kind of freehold and contact them directly. And we're just not really kind of set up in this project to do that. It's not ideal, I appreciate, but that's
useful. Yeah.
Well, I think that building is probably best not allocated to anyone.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, Pam, it still happens. I mean, I was going to mention this anyway, but sadly, Ken can't make it next Wednesday. Transport and travel and weather are permitting. Pierre and I will be hopefully joining you for the event, for the training session. Walkabout. We could have a look then if time allows, Pam, and just cast our eye over it and see. But I agree, probably if it's not going to be anything other than a gate and a wall, we might not need to allocate it specifically.
Yeah, I'll leave it out for now then, I think. And I don't know if there's any others that people can immediately think about. That are in that position.
But yeah, suffice it to say, access is one of our perennial topics of discussion about how best to get in.
We basically don't want you to have to, deal with any particular issue which is going to cause difficulty. And because this is a pilot, it's not absolutely essential that we do every single listed building. We can cope with a few missing, although obviously our ambition is to try and do as many as possible. So that sounds like a sensible way forward. Yes, so next Wednesday, Dave is going to be leading the session. Dave, do you want to say anything about your session at this stage, or?
Well, really, I think what we've planned is we're going to meet at the chapel, aren't we? We could perhaps use that as just an initial example before people go out on site. We could just talk through, some of the stuff we've just covered, but just talk through about using that as an example, perhaps.
Yeah.
And then, you know, people aren't just going out coldly to look at other buildings, are they? So I thought we could just run through that building as an example, basically, just, you know, looking at what we can photograph and, you know, how to understand it, etc.
Yeah. And we could do, you know, a few other buildings that sort of in the central area. I was thinking of Gateacre.
Yeah. Well, we could do 2 or 3, or
yeah.
in fact, let's have a chat afterwards, and we can just decide which ones we're gonna look at.
Yeah. And then following on from that, so probably the sort of tail end of the session, because we're starting at 10. You'll be arriving, Luke, won't you? At sort of about sort of 11:45, 12 o'clock, something like that.
Yeah, I think we'll aim for, yeah, that's
so you'll get in touch when you're approaching, and then we'll try and make sure that we're not too far away, if you like, from there. And then some of the volunteers have kindly agreed to sort of join us for a little bit of a discussion over lunch at the Bear and Staff, and then some of them who know their area much better than me will be more than happy to walk around with you to show you some of the buildings, and then until that point you need to leave or until you've had enough.
I'm sure it'll be cool. But yes, that's fantastic. That's great. It'd be really good just to get, you know, to actually meet you all in person, obviously, but also to get to know the area. That's really valuable for us. So
yeah. So so I think that's sort of taking shape really next week, and we should get a reasonable number of volunteers able to join us. Not everyone can, but I appreciate that. But it's good to see so many of you today.
Definitely. No, I really appreciate it. And as I said at the outset, you know, we're really grateful to you all for your time and just for the enthusiasm to help us out with this. And hopefully it'll be very interesting for everyone, and we'll get something good out of it. Dave, I just, as well as that, I wondered, and I hope you don't mind, but just from your own, as it were, experience, professional use of the NHLE, I mean, what your thoughts on this project are, if you've got a sense of the likely benefits of it, if it chimes with the sort of world you encounter in terms of work on the NHLE.
Well, I think really we need to see the outcomes and see what we find out from that. But it's certainly interesting, I think, it's certainly interesting to try. It's probably more a question actually for my business partner Hannah Barter, who's done quite a bit of volunteer-led input into heritage. So I know she's done projects with some of the London boroughs and Luton and the Peak District. So it's involving people in buildings at risk work and in local lists as well. So it's probably worth a conversation actually with Hannah for what she's found out from similar projects. And obviously we do a lot of work with local communities in planning for historic areas as well, but no, I mean, I await the outcomes to see see what happens. But yeah, as I say, it probably is worth conversation as well with involving Hannah, just to draw on some of the other experience we've got with volunteer involvement as well. Just maybe add a bit of a dimension, to the.
That's a good point.
I just wonder, we've got a few minutes before we finish, whether it's worth just asking a question of the volunteers about whether anyone is aware of local listing and what that means. Just put your hand out if you know about what it is, just so we can just take a...
Sorry, Pam, I didn't quite hear what you said there.
I'll say it again. I just wondered whether the volunteers could just let us know whether you've heard of the concept of local listing, and if you know anything about it, which is different from the national listing. But do you know about that at all?
Well, I've heard of it, yes.
Yeah. We decided not to sort of cover it in the presentation today because Liverpool is not one of the areas that's really progressing local lists at the moment, so it's not particularly relevant to you. But I don't know whether it's worth. Who's your local listing person? Anyone? Luke, who could just say a few words, maybe just for a minute.
Well, Ken, if you don't mind, obviously, because you were more sort of directly involved in the recent pilot project on that.
I don't want to confuse people. Just, maybe they may come across the concept, and it might be just worthwhile. We've got you here to say a few words.
Local listing, certainly. It's similar in kind of nature to national listing in that it's a list of important heritage assets. They can be buildings, they can be archaeological sites, parks, gardens. Everything that's on the national list can be in local list, and a few more things can be locally listed. It's called a non-statutory designation because it doesn't have a legal weight. But what it does have is weight in the planning system, so that if you put in a planning application, then the fact that it's a locally listed building has to be taken into account, has to be addressed by the application, has to be addressed by the local planning authority. It's a list that's put together by local people, and I'm not going to define local people more closely because it differs from local authority to local authority. In one local authority I worked with, it was a civic society. In another, there's been a couple of faith groups that have put together a local list, and so on. So what it requires, just the same as with national listing, it requires a set of criteria that need to be agreed. It needs to have a mechanism to have things added. It needs to have a mechanism to have things removed. And it's runs through your local authority, and it's held by the Historic Environment Record.
Yeah. There is currently a pilot going on in Merseyside, in Knowsley, Sefton and Wirral, which the Civic Society, Merseyside Civic Society is involved with. So that will be quite interesting to see how it goes. They've created a sort of a website for people to upload information onto. And obviously these would be buildings that are not on the national list. So we're talking about, you're on one or the other. If you're on the national list, you wouldn't go on the local list.
You can't locally. There's no point in locally listing a nationally listed structure.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's I suppose it's another tier of not exactly protection, because it's not really protection, but it's consideration, I suppose, particularly in planning terms, which is why I think Liverpool don't want to do it. I mean, we have regular meetings with Liverpool City Council, and we keep raising it, but they just sort of say no. There are issues with local listing, because you can get property owners who feel that it's going to be detrimental to their ability to sell the asset or do anything to the asset, develop the asset. So there are issues, and I think, suppose in an area like Liverpool, there's quite a lot of redundant buildings that are looking for new uses. They don't see it as being particularly helpful, but that I'm not saying we should agree with that, but that's just the overall view, political view as well in Liverpool at the moment. But you just may come across it, so that's why I'm just raising it.
It's worth just adding to what was said there. I mean, while it's true that we would very unlikely have it in both cases, one of the things about, which has been very obvious here, the national listing system delivers against those statutory criteria published by DCMS, the two of special architecture and historic interest. Obviously, the criteria by which a local list is determined can be broader than that, and is obviously locally determined, not nationally determined. So it can have more of an ability to recognise what would be considered locally significant in a way that statutory listing just cannot do. And we have often found ourselves in a situation where us saying that doesn't meet the criteria is seen as a very negative and sort of critical, we don't value it, and that can be not at all meant, but can sometimes be what's taken away. So having, as it were, abilities to use other local or community-based interest as a signifier of value can mean that it just adds power to the whole system, rather than it always depending on that statutory process that is by its nature limited. So, and I mean, I don't know, I often wonder about the nature of whether or not something could be on the national list because of one thing and on the local list because of another. But I agree, it's very rare that the two things.
Well, an interesting example is that I was in Gateacre earlier on this week, and I was chatting to one of the volunteers who's not here today, and she was saying, I'm surprised that is it Sandfield Terrace or Sandfield Road or Lane, whatever it is, by the side of Nourish there, people who know the area will know what I mean. That there's properties there that isn't on the list, and we went to have a look at it. There's a nice little, like a Victorian cottage to me, and which doesn't seem to be on the list, and I was quite surprised it wasn't. And that would be the sort of candidate that you might want to pull out for a local listing rather than national list. I'd say that from a position of complete ignorance. I don't really know, but I couldn't find it on the list. So
I mean, ultimately, a local list doesn't stop anyone from dropping the building anyway. So although it's a material consideration, there's no kind of demolition control. So that's quite weak in that way. But something we have been doing more recently is policy on non-designated heritage. So to give an example, there's a housing estate in Ramsgate, which has it's kind of a planned housing estate, but there's little hints of modern movement architecture in the estate, and its layout as well. It's kind of, the green space is very much part of the layout. So we actually wrote a character policy, a development character policy around the specific estate, which then means at least you've got statutory policy, to try and retain the character. Still doesn't stop anyone from just dropping the houses, so
Yeah. And just one final question I've got, and I think I know the answer, but blue plaques or plaques on buildings, that's nothing to do with you, is it? Historic England?
It's done by English Heritage. Obviously, back when English Heritage was one big organisation, it was all of us, but it's an expert panel run through English Heritage or other local heritage trusts that have an equivalent scheme, but it's not something we do. But the recognition of association is a big issue around how we could do that in a proportionate way. But no, the straight answer is no.
We probably get, as a civic society, we probably get more inquiries from people wanting to get plaques on buildings than virtually anything else. It's it's a big thing. And obviously, dare I say, in terms of the children home of the Beatles were all cause célèbres at the time because they are listed, but listed as, because of that association, they are very standard by sort of normal measures, suburban housing, but they are therefore not what normal people would expect to be listed, but that significance was deemed to be sufficient. So yes, local examples of those debates. Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Good. Any other questions from anyone?
It's not a question, but can I just apologise for coming and going? Because when we had the break, I tried to do something else on my computer and only succeeded in freezing it. So I had to restart the computer. And as soon as I did that, I realised that I hadn't had it plugged in. So the battery had gone. And so now I'm on my tablet. And I hope this is giving a very good illustration of what Ken was saying about shadows and how they can distort things. So I'm sitting near a very big window and it's very sunny here. So apologies for coming and going. It must have been distracting.
That's always fun.
And similarly for me, sorry about my internet and also the sun.
Does illustrate my point about charging your batteries before you start.
Charge your phone.
Because I wanted to pay good attention, I'd moved the laptop onto the table, whereas normally where I'm sitting, it's just plugged in next to me and I'd completely forgotten to move it. So it was fully charged, but of course Zoom, lots of screens, it really drains the battery.
Yeah. Well, that's very nice and lovely to see.
Are we done? Is there anything you want to say in conclusion, Luke? Or?
No, not really. Just that's been a really helpful session. I hope it's been informative for you all and kind of giving you answers to questions. But as noted, we'll be able to answer more as they arise, and we will share presentations, obviously, so you can get all those links and have the information to hand. Very much looking forward to seeing those of you we can next week, and otherwise, just great to be working on you with this project, and hope we can really get some learning together and some good outcomes for them. Dave says. So thank you all very much.
Well, thank you. I think it's been I find it very interesting, certainly, and sure our volunteers have. And we look forward to seeing you next week. We'll be in touch.
Yes, we'll be.
Okay, so I'll let you all go then.
Thank you, John. Thank you,
everyone. Thank you very much.
Bye for now.
Cheers.
Bye bye. Bye bye.